you know. I can't get out of the city, believe me, I've tried. You're Murdoch, aren't you? The one they've been looking for.
You're not a killer.
They set you up with a fake identity, like everyone else in this place.
Who are you?
Used to be a cop. At least, in this life I was. They steal people's memories, you know. Then they swap them around between us. I've seen them do it back and forth, till no one knows who they are anymore.
How do you know all this?
Once in a while, one of us wakes up while they're changing things. It's not supposed to happen, but it does. It happened to me. They'll come looking for you, Murdoch. Just like they'll come looking for me. But that's okay. I figured a way out.
Hi, welcome to the 90s and Beyond, a film podcast that looks at movies of the 1990s as well as films that were spin-offs from or sequels to or somehow influenced by movies of the 1990s. My name is Vince Leo. I have been a film reviewer since the middle of the 1990s. 1996 to be exact is when I first published a film review online. You can find all of my written work at my website quipster.net, QWIPSTER.net. I've been doing podcasts now for nearly 10 years as well, and I do another podcast called Around the World in 80s Movies, so if you like what you hear here, I do encourage you, if you also like films of the 1980s, to check that out. You can find the link to that at quipster.net. Today I'm going to be getting into a film that came out in 1998, and it's called Dark City. Dark City is an R-rated film. It does have violent images as well as some sexuality. The runtime is an hour and 40 minutes, although the director's cut, which maybe some people prefer to watch, is an hour and 51 minutes. Rufus Sewell, Kiefer Sutherland, Jennifer Connelly, William Hurt, Richard O'Brien, and Ian Richardson are in the cast. The director of Dark City is Alex Proyas. Proyas also contributed to the screenplay, along with Lem Dobbs and David S. Goyer. Now, there were a lot of seeds of inspiration for Dark City. Some of them started when Alex Proyas was a young boy. He was deathly afraid of the dark, and even more so when he started having these recurring nightmares that would involve these strange-looking bald men who would come out at night and chase him with knives. Proyas, when he would wake up, he felt that these strange men surely must have had the ability to alter reality, because he would notice things in his bedroom were rearranged from what he thought he had remembered before he went to sleep. As a teenager, Proyas was somebody who was passionate about reading. He favored a lot of science fiction novels by authors like Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, Brian Aldiss. He especially liked stories where characters were finding out somehow by the end of the story that their reality is actually not reality. It's revealed to be some sort of elaborate artificial creation or some sort of experiment. And Proyas wondered if he could be living in some sort of alternate reality that was created by those mystery men that he had in his recurring nightmares when he was a boy. Proyas also at this time started reading a lot of graphic novels, some Japanese manga. He was a big fan of Heavy Metal magazine, and he would also read anything by Moebius. When he was about 15, he wrote a script for this potential animated short film, he thought. He entitled the script he wrote for that Pedestrian Furniture. That was his first incorporation of the strange men that were in his childhood nightmares who could move furniture around as he slept. As an adult, Proyas expanded his mind even more. He became interested in Gnostic philosophy. He really enjoyed the psychology of Freud and Jung, and he especially enjoyed this 1903 autobiography by a man named Daniel Paul Shreber called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. Shreber's memoirs detailed firsthand his experience undergoing psychosis. This autobiography gave you an image of the world as it was experienced through the delusions of a psychotic mind. Proyas began to free associate all of these things that he enjoyed, and he worked them into a new script idea in late 1989 after he had already become a filmmaker, and he directed his first feature called Spirits of the Air, Gremlins of the Clouds. Proyas would take all of these ideas all the way back from his recurring nightmares to his sci-fi love to all of those comic books he would read, as well as the Gnostic philosophy and the psychology and Daniel Shreber's memoir, and he would just free associate it into a script. He didn't have any knowledge of how any of those things would fit together narratively or thematically. And he entitled it at that time Sleepwalker, and it was a very surrealist concept that would blend all of this love of fantasy and science fiction and philosophy and psychology. Although Proyas' ideas were very broad at the time, he tried to keep the concept of the plot, at least, small because he felt it was likely going to be made very cheaply in Australia on a shoestring budget. Being a fan of Hollywood film noir mysteries, Proyas began with a hard-boiled detective as his main protagonist. Proyas named him Frank Bumstead, and Proyas really keyed in on the notion of a detective who was somebody who was very logical and very analytical, going insane as he started searching for clues. Ultimately, it would reveal that he's living in a fantasy realm generated and manipulated by these otherworldly creatures that he can't comprehend ever existing. For inspiration, Proyas began reading Raymond Chandler's crime novels, and those really inspired Proyas to break from telling his story solely from the detective's point of view, because he really liked that Raymond Chandler's narratives followed the perspective of multiple characters within a very layered and very complex plot. So, as he continued to revise that script, he expanded his supporting characters using traditional film noir archetypes. And meanwhile, his fantasy entities controlling reality were more steeped for cinema that influenced film noir, going back especially to the silent era and German expressionist cinema, films like Metropolis and Nosferatu, M and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The atmosphere that Proyas envisioned for this was influenced especially by American architect Hugh Ferris, who happened to also influence the early Batman comics as well. Further revisions to his screenplay toyed with titles like Shadows and Mystery Men, but Proyas eventually settled on Dark City because he felt that that title best captured the film noir vibe he was going for. Even through these revisions, Proyas still had not come up with any explanation for the Mystery Men's origins or the motivations for why they control the lives of the human characters. He was writing here still purely from a subconscious level that even he didn't fully understand. He saw the Mystery Men somehow as some sort of metaphor for how humans were unconsciously manipulated all the time by government, by media, by corporations. He felt that if we wanted to live as humans, we should be resisting all of that control that we have all around us. Fleshing out his secondary characters eventually prompted Proyas to shift the story's protagonist. It was the hard-boiled detective. Now he's decided to make the main murder suspect the main character, an amnesiac named Jonathan White. Proyas felt that his character arc, as well as the emotional stakes for him, were much more exciting than they were for the detective. The detective's arc was broken down into two characters, Bumstead, still, the current homicide detective, as well as Thompson, who he would later in more recent revisions call Walensky. Thompson was the previous detective who ends up going mad while he's trying to solve the case, and the closer he gets, the more he can't comprehend it. Gruesome moments of body horror ran all throughout Proyas' story here. The Mystery Men, led by evil guy called Mr. Black, they're not really men. They're really insects that are animating human cadavers from within their skulls. The Mystery Men also could use robotic bugs to spy on humans, and they also create a killing machine at some point toward the climax, who happens to be a puppet outfitted with a lot of tools and deadly weapons. Dr. Shreber, the homage to the original Daniel Paul Shreber, he's a psychologist who's studying Jonathan White. He reveals that they're living in a world made from the insect's dreams. After most of the human characters end up dying horrifically in the story, there's a court case climax. It ends up exonerating Jonathan White, and it's followed by an epilogue on an ocean pier where White meets up with a woman and then begins strangling her, revealing he is, indeed, a murderer. Alex Proyas was working on 1994's film The Crow, and that's when Hollywood studios took notice of him. So they started offering him action or comic book style follow-ups that he had no interest in directing. He counteroffered these studio offers with his own, the Dark City script. The studios would read them and eventually they would decline. They felt that there was zero commercial viability for this weird phantasmagorical concept that really doesn't make a lot of sense, at least to them. So Proyas decided he needed a little bit of help trying to get this script into shape, so he reached out to Dennis Potter. And Potter, a good writer and very supportive of Proyas' script, but he politely declined because he said that it was a bit too insane, maybe a little bit frightening as well. He possibly also turned it down because he was gravely ill at the time, too. By the way, the film, Dark City, happens to be dedicated to the memory of Dennis Potter in the closing credits. So Proyas decided, well, he'll continue on his own, and he took a lot of the studio feedback that he got for his script to heart, and he started working more on his script. He reduced a lot of the gruesome qualities of the script, and he wanted to provide a better rationale for what was going on underneath the story. Instead of the dreams of the insects, the city maybe was better built from the memories of the human characters. And new themes within the story explored whether memories are what makes humans what we are. He gave the mystery men finally a modus operandi. They experiment on humans for the purpose of seeing what makes us do the things that we do. If they implant memories of a serial killer into an innocent person, is that person going to be prone to murder, or will he remain innocent as he was before the implant? Now, sensing a hit with The Crow, Miramax, the studio behind The Crow, they showed interest in producing Dark City as a follow-up, with Edward R. Pressman slotted as the producer. But because Miramax happened to be undergoing a very tumultuous management change at the time, Proyas decided, given that he was getting some clout for The Crow, especially when it was released and it was very financially successful, he would shop it around elsewhere and see if he could find a better deal. The tragedy of Brandon Lee's accidental death while he was making The Crow found Proyas trying to let off some steam. He retreated to Cannes, France for a spell. Disney chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg did find him there, and he visited Proyas' hotel room. He wanted to discuss the possibility of Disney working with Proyas on a future project that he was interested in. And Proyas happened to mention he had a project he was trying to make, Dark City. So Katzenberg, he set up a meeting to come pitch that in Hollywood. The executives at Disney were not pleased when they finally read it. It was nonsensical, it was repulsive, they felt. But because Katzenberg was very high on Proyas, they decided to place it still under development under their Touchstone banner, with Proyas' partner Andrew Mason producing. Now, as they were working through the script, Proyas started receiving a lot of studio notes from Disney, relating a lot of things that were not very flattering to him. The characters didn't work, the story didn't make sense, and the narrative aspects, there were a lot he should probably add and a lot he should probably remove. And all of these notes made Proyas begin to lose faith. He wondered why Disney was continuing to work so hard with them on the script that they could never conceptually grasp, and they absolutely seemed to despise every aspect of. Proyas rationalized to himself that maybe, as a director, his storytelling was emphasizing too much the visual components instead of putting in a lot of those emotional hooks that usually grab audiences. So he approved Disney's suggestion that they bring in a professional screenwriter to make Dark City much more accessible. Among the many things that Proyas was offered after he had directed The Crow, he especially enjoyed the script for Blade, which was based on a Marvel Comics idea. So he decided to contact the screenwriter of Blade, David S. Goyer. However, when Proyas learned that Goyer happened to be actively working on the sequel to The Crow, a sequel that Proyas adamantly opposed, he thought that they should absolutely end the series with the death of Brandon Lee. The conversation between Proyas and Goyer grew awkward, and Goyer thought it was probably best to decline. Disney then assigned Kafka screenwriter Lem Dobbs to come in. He was especially tasked to bolster the characterizations. He wanted to reduce cliches, and he wanted to eliminate a lot of the pretentiousness that was in the script. Proyas did like that Dobbs was a film noir aficionado like him, especially because he was somebody who is British and American. He could deliver a lot of Americanisms of older eras, phrases like the heebie-jeebies or places like the automat. Dobbs really worked hard to sand down those phantasmagorical elements in the script, and he grounded the narrative into a firmer reality, while he also converged all of the character destinies. He channeled them all into one cause. Dobbs did feel that the protagonist being named Jonathan White And the antagonist named Mr. Black, that was way too trite. That was too on the nose. Proyas suggested maybe John Walker, but Dobbs thought that this too was cliche. They eventually settled on John Murdoch. Dobbs also injected a plot line that he had seen before in this episode of The Outer Limits called a feasibility study. And in a feasibility study, there are aliens who teleport an entire section of a city, including the people, to their home planet, and that's where they're going to study the feasibility of turning all of humanity into slaves there, because these aliens are suffering from a genetic disease where they become immobile as they grow older. The humans eventually discover the alien intentions. They decide to fight for their souls, which is their freedom of choice. So he thought the strangers here could be aliens that abducted humans to populate a city, the city that is floating in space, so that it was always dark, for experimentation on how to save themselves from extinction. Dobbs also fleshed out Murdoch's wife. He developed a love story inspired by the Nicholas Ray film called In a Lonely Place. And that's where romance blossoms between a woman who helps a murder suspect she doesn't really know. Dobbs keyed in especially to the line in the film called I was born when she kissed me, I died when she left me, I lived a few weeks while she loved me. Dobbs found a way for Emma, his wife, changed from Elizabeth from the earlier drafts, to appear throughout to add purpose to Murdoch's quest. Dobbs found a lot of ways to inject Emma throughout the story. Emma was renamed from Elizabeth in Proyas' earlier scripts, and she would appear throughout the story to add further purpose to Murdoch's quest. Now, Disney's interest unfortunately plummeted when their suggestions to quote-unquote dumb it up to broaden the appeal could not really be done without unraveling this very intricate plot until it became nonsensical. And eventually, they grew tired of trying to work it out. They viewed Dark City at that point as unfilmable, and they put it into turnaround. Licking his wounds, Proyas then decided he needed to get back into direct, and he took Steven Spielberg up on an offer to direct Casper, the Friendly Ghost. And unfortunately, during the pre-production phase, creative conflicts about Casper's tone, the lack of a finished script, as well as Steven Spielberg's weird bossiness, started ruffling Proyas' feathers, and he decided he was just going to depart. 20th Century Fox did pick Dark City up in mid-1995, and they announced it as their first production for Fox's new Sydney studios they were developing in Australia. To get the screenplay back into shape, Proyas sought David Goyer once again. This time, Goyer was much more amenable to Proyas' offer. Goyer's agent did try to steer him away from it because he felt that high-concept, expensive movies like this rarely ever get made in the end. Goyer did, though, accept. He was an Australia file. He was very curious to do work there, so he wanted to go to Australia and work on this film. He also happened to be somebody who very much related to the film, having recurring dreams of his own as a kid about a mystery man that would haunt him. Goyer came in, he added especially action sequences to make it more exciting, and a more science fiction-based underpinning to make the premise more relatable and a lot less weird. Goyer also incorporated more motifs. He took a spiral motif that was in Proyas' original script and he developed it throughout the story because he felt that it would symbolize more the search for the human soul. For the lead, Proyas suggested maybe Ray Fiennes or Liam Neeson. Fox nixed Fiennes because Strange Days had just bombed at the box office. And Liam Neeson at that time wasn't really much of a box office draw at all. Things did pause when Fox began negotiations with Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise had expressed an interest in doing a science fiction film and they were looking for a project for him, and this happened to be a very timely one. Now, Proyas felt a huge star like Tom Cruise was going to be a double-edged sword because it did increase the chance of it getting made. The studio was very excited about doing a Tom Cruise vehicle, but it also would bring with it a major star's demands, which would completely alter the story if he didn't really like some aspect or another. And there would obviously be much more studio scrutiny because they were going to be investing much more money into the picture. In fact, Cruise was offered at the time much more money than Dark City's entire budget was. Talks did, unfortunately, for Proyas end when Fox president Todd Jacobson resigned, and many of his projects were canceled, including Dark City. It did get picked up again in April 1996 when New Line Cinema picked it up as part of a two-picture deal with Proyas. The other picture he was going to make was Quatermass in the Pit. Didn't quite come to fruition for him there, but New Line did offer a lot more creative freedom than he was offered by the other two big studios. They did request a title change, though, because New Line's parent company, Warner Brothers, was working on a film with a very similar title at the time called Mad City, and that was slated for release at the same time as Dark City. So they decided they were going to change the name. Eventually, they settled on Dark World. Unfortunately, when that was released to the public, Steven Spielberg, who happened to be working on The Lost World, which was going to be slated for release around that time, he threatened legal action. So they changed it to Dark Empire. And that's when the other big wig, George Lucas, came in. Lucasfilm prompted legal action saying Dark Empire was something they already had rights to. They did a comic for Dark Horse based on Star Wars called Dark Empire. So eventually they did find that they would revert to Dark City because the release date ended up getting pushed beyond Mad City's run in the movie theater. And Mad City didn't do very well anyway, so it really didn't bear much of a conflict at all. They did change, at some point during the story, the Mystery Men, as they were called in the script, to The Strangers. And that was to avoid copyright issues with this existing comic book superhero property at the time being developed into a film adaptation that would come out in 1999. Now, as I mentioned, Proyas did get a lot of creative freedom when he was making Dark City with New Line. However, New Line did have a list of what they called preferred actors that they thought would be interesting to put into this film. And those included Jim Carrey, who did pretty well with New Line when he made The Mask, Johnny Depp, and the oddest choice among the list was David Letterman, believe it or not. But Proyas did insist on casting freedom. He wanted an unknown in the starring role because he thought audiences should not assume Murdoch was a hero just based on the casting. So Proyas eventually selected, among the many who auditioned, British art house regular Rufus Sewell. He felt that Sewell had a very unique vibe. He was intelligent. He had dangerous looks that would be very good for the part. He admired Sewell because he had seen him before in British TV and stage productions. He liked his energy. He liked his vitality. And he had a really good sense of humor. He liked working with him. Sewell also happened to be handsome enough to be a leading man, but he also had a lot of idiosyncrasies in his performance that would be characteristic of a character actor. Now, Sewell came in, he found portraying Murdoch to be a challenge because Murdoch was an amnesiac, so he was basically a blank canvas. And furthermore, Proyas was not going to reveal Murdoch's backstory to Sewell until it was time to actually film it. And he specifically did this so that Sewell's performance was going to remain ambiguous. Could he be the killer or could he be innocent? Sewell had to play it not both ways, but neither way. To help himself, Sewell observed that maybe having no memories would make Murdoch like a child. So he would play Murdoch as somewhat childlike, but he would have adult instincts and vocabulary. Green screen work throughout the film also became a challenge for Sewell because he was playing to a blank wall oftentimes, while also having to portray this character on the edge of emotion without even knowing anything about him, and that made centering his performance very much difficult. He felt somehow too far removed of what he was going to do, although Proyas says that does work for that character. Now, William Hurt came in. Originally, Hurt wanted to play Dr. Shreber in this film, but Proyas encouraged him to take the role of Frank Bumstead instead. Now, Proyas he had a reputation of being a very demanding actor, and Proyas did also find him to be very much so, but he felt that Hurt's persistent questioning of his script caused him many times to reconsider his ideas for the better. In previous drafts, the detective had a mother living in an iron lung that he would serenade with his accordion. If you see this film, there is an accordion that still remains in the movie. You don't see the mother. It's kind of left a little bit more to the imagination as to why, thematically, it might be in the piece. Now, for the female lead, Jennifer Connelly, that was not the studio's first choice. In fact, Lem Dobbs told Proyas that Connelly just was a little too young-looking, maybe too baby-faced to play the sultry femme fatale in this film noir-ish movie. But Proyas felt that Connelly did bring a lyrical quality to Emma that he liked, so she was hired. Now, Connelly was scripted to do a nude scene. She said that she didn't want to do it, though, if she was going to take the part. She, at that time, had been topless in a lot of films, and she wanted to be taken a little bit more seriously as an actress. There may have been another reason, though, that she didn't want to get nude. She didn't really reveal until the very last day of the shoot that she was, during that time, pregnant. Connelly did have a very challenging time playing Emma. Particularly frustrating was trying to find the character motivations of Emma, because she's supposed to be confused that Murdoch is not acting as she remembers him. Now, she has implanted memories. He does not. So he's not acting as he should, because his memories, you come to find out, were never injected. There are a couple of singing performances done by Emma during the film as a lounge singer. Anita Kelsey's voice was used for Emma's singing performances, only in the theatrical version, though. If you watch the director's version, Jennifer Connelly's original vocals are restored for that take. Dr. Shreber, he was intended all along for an older actor. Proyas envisioned him as like Ben Kingsley when he was writing that role, but Ian Holm was the main actor that was sought for that role before Proyas ended up connecting with Kiefer Sutherland. Proyas and Sutherland became friends. They both met at Brandon Lee's funeral, and they decided to meet at a hotel bar to talk about the Dark City script. Now, Kiefer came in. He had already read the script when he came in, and he was really locked in on the Shreber role as something that he could portray. Now, Proyas said, no, this actually is for an older person. Maybe Kiefer's father, Donald Sutherland, could play it, but Kiefer said, no, actually, he thought that Shreber would be much more of a tragic figure if he were younger, if he had his life ahead of him, for him to become so twisted at a younger age. Now, Proyas did express some doubts until Sutherland decided. He stood up in front of everybody in the hotel bar area, and he started reading Shreber's lines. He transformed his speech, his mannerisms into lisps and stutters, and became very frantic right in front of Proyas and any of the other bystanders who were looking on, suggesting that Shreber should be nervous and apprehensive because he had not interacted with a cognizant human in some time. And during that manic performance, Proyas saw Shreber within Kiefer and decided to give him the role then and there. Now, Lem Dobbs, he was rehired to come back and calibrate the script after it had already been warped and changed by Fox. So Dobbs came in and he individualized characters, specifically not for the humans, but for the strangers. So they all had different names. Mr. Hand, who gets imprinted with Murdoch's memories at some point during that. Mr. Hand reveals that the city is actually fashioned on human memories, revised daily to study test humans to find the secret of individual souls. And they're doing that to avoid evolutionary extinction because the strangers had lost their souls by evolving too much into becoming one big mindset. They were not individuals really so much anymore. Because the original story ended up at a beach pier, they decided that Shell Beach would be like a fictitious place because they were in outer space, so it really didn't exist. And that would be concocted as a memory by the strangers to try to manipulate city residents into being compliant, and that would lead to a better situation for all of them. Now, for the look of the strangers, Proyas modeled the look after actor Richard O'Brien's character in this 1994 British children's TV show called The Ink Thief. When casting, Proyas contacted O'Brien, who was very amenable to playing the role because the premise reminded him very much of a TV show, one of his favorites, called The Prisoner. Now, Proyas cast all of the other strangers in O'Brien's mold, and he instructed the actors playing the strangers to follow O'Brien's lead as for how to do their performances. O'Brien did find it still very challenging to try to remove emotion from his performance because the strangers are not supposed to exhibit any. O'Brien, when he wasn't in front of the camera, he played a lot of guitar, and he jokingly came up with the idea of making Dark City into a musical instead, and he would frequently regale Proyas with these impromptu plot-related songs, including one about necrophilia, which was very memorable to Proyas. The small robotic killer puppet that was from Proyas' earlier scripts, he was turned into a character called Mr. Sleep. Now, they couldn't afford robotic effects for this film, so they decided to re-envision Mr. Sleep. Instead of a robot or a puppet, he was a child. The shoot would take place at the newly opened Fox Studios in Australia at the Sydney Showgrounds, and every scene took place at night, so an indoor set would be ideal. Actors who had signed on hoping that they would spend a lot of their time enjoying the Australian beaches, instead spent all day from pretty much wake to sleep in this darkened hangar. They could only really go to the beach like on the weekends. Exteriors were shot in a section of Sydney called The Rocks, which had architecture that was dating way back to the 1920s. In retrospect, Dobbs observes that the city in Dark City itself feels very much patterned after Sydney, Australia, as he's come to see it, especially as it was built from Proyas' own childhood memories of certain shops and amusements that he remembered there. And given that there's a nostalgic search for childhood in the story, return to the past to know yourself in the present, it's very fitting that Proyas emulates the characters by fashioning this city completely out of his memories. Now, because the city is built on memories, designs for the buildings and locales are very inconsistent, not only in their architecture, but also the time period. Production designer Patrick Tatopoulos came in and he employed a lot of his favorite artistic influences, Vasquez and Bruegel and Bosch, and he especially keyed in on the cinematography that you would see in F.W. Murnau's films, especially Nosferatu. Proyas referenced also the police photography of Ouija, who depicted a lot of people falling asleep, and he would use that as his inspiration for how people during the tuning would appear. CG elements are sparse, but they do come in and enhance a lot of the miniature work, the painted matte backgrounds. There's psychic energy that's there, kind of CG done, feeling the subterranean machines that control the world above in this process called the tuning. Tatopoulos got the idea of morphing the buildings of the cityscape while he was working on Independence Day, and he saw that the crew would be moving all of these building facades around the set for different city setups. And Proyas himself remembered very small-scale buildings that were put on wheels that were moved around during the Crow to represent different places in the city. And he thought it was really cool to see these buildings looking like they were moving around on their own. He couldn't see the technicians actually moving them around. And that visual component he decided to put into the film as part of the plot development for the tuning. Now, again, not everything was fully thought out. There is no explicit origin still for the strangers. It is revealed that they're insectoid parasites. Maybe they're from another dimension. Maybe they're extraterrestrial. The implication is certainly there. They control and animate human cadavers. And all of this was inspired because in the real-life Dr. Shreber's memoirs, he felt that there were scorpions living inside his head as he walked among the corpses. And the bugs being in his head, as well as walking among corpses, became very much a part of the stranger's existence. Dobbs viewed the strangers more akin to the Fates because they could control people's lives, and they often did that to help their own cause. And Goyer observed the strangers were really what humanity could become if we ended up losing our souls. They had reached this apex in evolution where they were pretty much bored and they were testing humans like marketing executives, hoping to find their missing mojo. Now, it's also, conversely, never explained where the humans do originate. Why are they in this dark city? Where do they come from? Proyas envisioned them as maybe coming from this intergalactic spaceship from 1,000 years from now. Goyer thought that the city could represent more like a purgatory, and the humans were deceased and figuring out which way they were going to go. Now, as for the tuning employed by the strangers to manipulate people's memories and the geography of the city, Proyas argues that they actually aren't doing magic. They don't have any magical powers, but instead it's really some sort of evolutionary psychological advancement among this very sophisticated race with a shared mind. Just as Arthur C. Clarke observed that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, he also felt that, like Robert Anton Wilson, he further promoted that advanced parapsychology would be even less distinguishable from magic. The film did, unfortunately, run over schedule and budget, and New Line pretty much threatened to shut down the entire production on the scheduled end of production date. Proyas insisted that the linking material was absolutely needed because the story was not going to make sense without it. So New Line at that point granted a 2-week additional pickup shoot sometime a little bit later. As Proyas did put together his work print, initial test screenings revealed that most viewers were very confused and very frustrated by Dark City. Proyas decided to go back and start re-editing the film. He wanted to try to make things clearer, but further test screenings with the re-edited version resulted in even worse scores for Dark City. So New Line allocated more funding, 3 more weeks of shooting, 7 weeks of additional second unit work to try to fix a lot of the narrative issues that were embedded in the film. They also wanted to switch the climax to add a more exciting confrontational climax in the end. Now, the original ending featured Murdoch's murder trial. That was deemed way too existential and very unsatisfying to audiences. And Proyas himself was growing very disenchanted with the sour tone anyway, where the strangers win, because he started feeling maybe humanity should really overcome their suppression. It was much more uplifting, and Murdoch leading the revolution by harnessing the strangers' powers would be very much a good thing to end the film on. And so now there was going to be a new climactic psychic battle. It pays homage to one of Proyas' favorite Japanese animated features called Akira. So the new ending was here to expand the world of Dark City. Now, New Line, as part of the bartering, in order for Proyas to be able to finish the film with additional money and additional time, he had to compromise and put a voice-over narration that was done by Kiefer Sutherland as Shreber for the prologue to clue in audiences before they see it as to what they're about to see. Now, Proyas found a lot of this tweaking and adding and removing of scenes very difficult for him because, you know, the plot really is kind of like a Chinese puzzle box. And so every time that you altered one scene, it actually would force you to make alterations to other scenes to try to, you know, re-explain how things were going. So New Line provided additional resources to complete the film, although still, even with the additional resources and additional time did run out yet again before it was fully completed. So Proyas feels, well, it's not really as complete a film as he would have wanted, but it's as complete as he could get given the resources he was given. Now, New Line decided they wanted to trim out some of the more overt gore and blood in the film because it was still a little gory, a little bloody. They wanted to get it down to a PG-13 rating to recoup some of that extra money they were putting into it. But the MPAA bestowed upon it an R rating anyway. So they went through the appeals process. They even brought in William Hurt to try to appeal it because, you know, sometimes big stars can get them to woo things their way. And they furthermore stated that, well, there's no sex scenes in the movie. There's really hardly any bad language at all. And the violence, very little of it is actually on screen. But the MPAA still said it was too intense and it was too weird to give it a PG-13 rating. Given that it was going to get an R rating anyway, they decided to go back and put back in the bloodier moments that they had trimmed out before to try to get PG-13. Now, Dark City's initial August 1997 release date, that was pushed forward to October initially, and then finally in February of 1998. They were trying to avoid competition with Titanic, although that wasn't very successful because Titanic actually got more popular as it went along. I mean, it was more popular, I think, in its 20th week than it was in its first week. Still, though, despite all of the changes and all of the edits and the extended shoots and the reshoots and the re-editing and the postponements and all of that, it still failed at the box office. It only earned about half of its reported budget in the United States. Now, it did get critical acclaim. It didn't really help the box office bottom line, though. Even Roger Ebert, one of the most popular film critics in the world, probably the most popular in the country at that time, proclaimed it the best film of 1998. Still didn't quite help it become a success. I personally find Dark City, it's an uneven film to me, to be sure. You know, there's a lot of aspects I like, and there are a lot of aspects that don't quite work for me. I don't get as emotionally invested as I feel because there's a lot of mechanics that you have to follow. I do, however, concede it is very masterful in terms of being a visual experience. It does contain a lot of nifty philosophical concepts that are worth pondering even beyond the film's runtime. And I especially would say that this was conceived a year prior to the similarly premised film The Matrix. And that alone should merit some respect for not being a Matrix ripoff. In fact, some people think that The Matrix ripped this film off because the Wachowskis did actually see a version of this film as they were shooting The Matrix. Now, as the title implies, the look of the film is very dark. It's similar in fashion to Proyas' previous film, The Crow, in that way. And it features similar lighting, emphasis on set design, and the same cinematographer, Dariusz Wolski. Others are probably going to compare it to other science fiction, very notable films, Metropolis, Blade Runner, Brazil. Those were very dark and dense and oppressively Kafkaesque cityscapes. I personally see Dark City as kind of a metaphor for Hollywood filmmaking. You could see the city basically kind of like a studio lot, which it was for the most part. Sets that change regularly. People, humans, are cast into different roles at the whims of the strangers, which are kind of like the studio heads, and they're crafting different stories set in this period drama that is full of damsels and killers and cops. Proyas himself actually compares it to filmmaking. He actually compared it, the strangers, to like demented script writers creating and revising and peopling their world with characters and situations. So maybe my hypothesis is not that far off. I do think it's a very nifty film. As I mentioned, it's very uneven. Some of the performances can be seen as hammy. I think Kiefer Sutherland's kind of an acquired taste here. Some people love him. Some people, like me, maybe not as much. He's sputtering and stuttering and wheezing and limping very campily, so I don't take it as seriously sometimes as I probably should. Characters, I don't really care about the characters in this film. I'm much more interested in the plot and how it's developing. So it's much more of a gimmicky film in that way. Much more relying on that. But in its defense, these characters are blank slates that are injected with memories. So maybe there's a reason why they're kind of a very shallow characterization. In the meantime, we're following these very dizzying plot points to try to solve this very loopy puzzle box. And, it is worth contemplating. To me, Dark City plays a lot like a graphic novel come to life, and given that graphic novels that Proyas grew up on were influences for this film, I could see why, and he just directed a graphic novel in The Crow, so it keeps that vibe. I do think it's a very intriguing, multi-layered mystery. It does merit multiple viewings. I've watched this movie a number of times. Even though I'm not super high on the film, I do like it, and I like it enough to watch it multiple times, and I do think that there's plenty to admire, even when you're waiting for the pieces to come together in multiple viewings. There is a bombastic finale, that Akira-inspired finale that gets a little bit silly with its head-to-head, literally head-to-head confrontation. And even though it did get the jump on the Matrix and kind of developing a city that actually happens to be a artificial concoction, Dark City did fail to make that same mainstream success as The Matrix, even though it's still championed by a very strong cult contingent. So all in all, I will give Dark City 3 stars out of 4. 3 stars on my scale means that I do think that it's worthwhile for people who like this kind of movie. Certainly if you're somebody who really loves science fiction, film noir kind of hybrids, especially, I love Blade Runner, which is a film noir science fiction hybrid. It's in that keeping, but certainly if you're in that vibe, there are people who were absolutely blown away by Dark City. I do think a lot of the concepts have been borrowed time and again, though, in newer films, such that if you've not seen it before, maybe you won't be as blown away as some people were at the time in 1998 when this was released, especially after you've seen The Matrix. But I respect the film probably more than I like the film, and that's why I give the film 3 stars out of 4. Now, during the production, they actually discussed that they could do a sequel to this film. Proyas at the time said that maybe it could be Murdoch getting corrupted by playing God over this, new world that he is helping to create. Because this film developed a cult following on video, there has been talk every once in a while over many years about doing a follow-up. In 2021, just a few years ago from the time of this recording, Proyas did release a 20-minute short film called Mask of the Evil Apparition. He says that is spiritually set in the Dark City universe. It's not specifically tied into Dark City, but he basically wrote it around the same time as he was doing Dark City, so there are a lot of parallels between the two stories. Proyas more recently also has begun work on a Dark City streaming series. He wants to do a series following the daughter of John and Emma, or Anna as she is at the end of this film, the Jennifer Connelly and Rufus Sewell characters, the offspring, and it would somehow pick up with that. Proyas has hinted in more recent interviews that Kiefer Sutherland could come back and return as Dr. Shreber for that. That awaits to be seen. There are a lot of concepts that never quite get made into series, but it is something that Proyas has continued to work on. If you're interested in Dark City, maybe it will get a follow-up in the end, after all. I hope that you enjoyed this retrospective look at Dark City. If you have your own thoughts on Dark City, if you think that maybe I'm not giving it enough credit, you can write to me. You can find my contact information at my website. That's at quipster.net, QWIPSTER.net. As far as what I'm going to be doing on the next show, well, I mentioned it several times through the course of this podcast. Might as well continue the next year with The Matrix. If you want to write to me, you can find my contact information on my website, quipster.net. Links to my Twitter feed, my Instagram, my Facebook are also there as well. Email, though, is the best way to get in touch with me if you have something that you want to talk about. Quipster.net is where to go. Until next time, thank you everyone for listening and joining me as we continue our journey to the 90s and beyond.